podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to The Racket Report, the podcast that tries to take you inside the world of organized crime. Well, one of the things about organized crime is it so often gets associated with Italians, La Cosa Nostra, the Mafia, the mob, whatever you want to call it. You picture these dingy settings with Mafia movies with guys with raspy voices and funny nicknames kissing each other on the cheek while eating Italian food. Well, the truth is somewhat more nuance than that, which is that every group has some sort of organized crime, including the black community. And there is this entire entity in Philadelphia which has made history as being part of the Philadelphia Black Mafia. And they're as noteworthy as any Italian mafia group anywhere in the country. And the person who has really done an incredible job chronicling exactly what went on in terms of Philadelphia's Black Mafia is someone that's no stranger to this podcast. We got rave reviews for his appearance when we were talking about the Tim Donaghy scandal and the mob's role in illegal sports betting. And that's Dr. Sean P. Griffin. He is a professor of criminal justice at the Citadel, a former Philadelphia police officer, and a best-selling author whose books include Black Brothers, Inc., The Violent Rise and Fall of Philadelphia's Black Mafia. Dr. Griffin, it's great to talk with you again. Thanks for joining me again.
Thanks for having me back.
All right. So you chronicled a lot of what we're about to talk about in your book, Black Brothers, Inc. and the Philadelphia Black Mafia. Let's talk about the basics. What is the Black Mafia? When we use that term, what does that mean?
Well, in the case of Philly, it's a specific group that was essentially around sometime early to mid 60s. This is where I, as an historian, make a subjective judgment. I say it ended roughly in the mid 1980s. The guys are still around, their offspring are still around, but they're nowhere near as organized. Whereas back in the day, for 20 years or so, they were running entire sections of the city, no different than Italian groups would, where you couldn't operate legally or illegally in certain parts of the city without paying them a tribute, typical racketeering, organized crime stuff. So they were a finite group. They called themselves the Black Mafia for obvious reasons. If you're an extortion-based syndicate, which is what they were, academics call them power syndicates, you can only go up to drug dealers and other criminals and ask for a tax if you've got a street rep. And that requires a certain degree of public violence. And in their case, they thought the name would help them, and it did. So what sparked your interest in covering the Philadelphia Black Mafia? I know you have Philly roots, and you talk about and write about crime a great deal, but why this? Wish I could take credit for this. I was a graduate student at Penn State. One of the leading organized crime scholars in the country at that time was a guy named Alan Block. He was doing research on a book on heroin trafficking along the Eastern Seaboard in the 1960s. He knew I knew people in the Philadelphia Police Department and asked me to see if I could get any information on two particular drug dealers. Really, they weren't even organized crime guys. They were just narcotics traffickers. I contacted my contacts in the Philadelphia Police Intelligence Unit and the Organized Crime Unit. They had nothing on the two people he was interested in, really. But one of the people in the Organized Crime Unit said, well, why are you interested in these people? And I said, well, a colleague is looking into this. And he said, oh, if you're looking into heroin trafficking in Philly at that time, you're talking about Philadelphia's Black Mafia. Now, Frank, what you have to understand is I'm born and raised in the city. My brother was a cop. My father was a cop. My brother was a cop. My father was a cop. I was a cop. Follow organized crime, research organized crime for a living, and I had never heard of this group. And so this sergeant took me into a room, and there was boxes full of files marked Philadelphia's Black Mafia. So I went back to my colleague Alan, and I said, just so you know, nothing on Frank Moten or Jack Brown, but they've got boxes and boxes of this group called Philly's Black Mafia. And he said, well, you'd be crazy not to write about that. And I thought, come on, man. At the time, I was doing Italians and Russians. And I said, I have no interest in this. And I almost turned it down. He said, what author would turn down access to primary source documents and have access to the gangsters themselves to interview? You can interview the cops, the detectives, the FBI agents, the U.S. attorneys. Like, it's amazing. Why? And any author would die for this. And so grudgingly, I took it on. And it was a smart move, and I give Alan all the credit.
And how large of a group are we talking about here?
Oh, big group. Depending on what source you use, FBI had one number, the Philadelphia Police Department Intel unit had another. If you're the heyday, I would say, was from 72, 73 through 83, 84, when a big racketeering case took them out. During that period, somewhere between 100 and 200 people. The meetings, they used to keep minutes at the meetings.
Wow.
The meetings typically of the leadership were always 10 to 20. But if you include the street enforcers and the entire apparatus of all the people who are running the drugs, the guns, the contracts, and all that sort of stuff, you were well over 100.
And I know we're talking about Philadelphia here. Was this a group that exclusively existed in Philadelphia? Did they try to branch out outside of Philly? Or were there other similar black organized crime groups that tried to emulate the Philadelphia model? Or was this really only a Philly-only thing?
Great question. Hard to answer that because in my experience, well, first of all, these guys, these finite people in Philly, they operated in New York City. They did a lot of work in Atlantic City. They did all sorts of things. For your audience may know, Cherry Hill, New Jersey is essentially a suburb of Philly, even though it's in another state right across the bridge. They worked a lot in Cherry Hill. They did some work in Las Vegas, some in California. But to your question as to whether there were similar syndicates elsewhere, my opinion, somewhat informed opinion, is yes. But the reason I hesitate is, and your audience is probably more familiar with this than others, at that moment in time, law enforcement did not treat organized crime other than Italians. That's what the training was for, whether it was from the FBI or from locals. And so there were syndicates elsewhere, but they weren't being treated that way, even in the case of Philly's Black Mafia.
Wow. I
mentioned earlier that I write in the book that the clusters of them were working together in the late 50s. And then you start getting to the 60s. Well, the problem was no one in law enforcement was connecting the murders, the extortion, the robbery. Obviously, some of them would get reported, and they'd be sitting in all these different police districts or in other files, but no one was looking at it holistically. Well, by the time you get to the early 70s, they don't start – think about this. This organized crime group has been running rampant all throughout sections of the city and South Jersey. And in 1972, there's a famous murder in April of 1972. It was with then the Club Harlem. Big, popular place. Frank Sinatra would play there, Dean Martin. It was a really eclectic mix of white and black entrepreneurs and celebrities. Well, they go there. Black Mafia wants to kill someone over a deal gone bad. Well, people who study organized crime realize a certain degree of public violence is necessary. You could obviously kill people in their bedroom, but that doesn't send shockwaves to all the other people you want to intimidate. So they go to a nightclub with 600 or 800 people, march across the dance floor with their guns drawn, and kill a bunch of people, including the target.
Whoa.
As a result of that case, the Atlantic City Police Department contacts Philly and says, hey, we need some intel on Philly's Black Mafia, to which Philadelphia's organized crime unit said, what is the Black Mafia?
Wow.
They had no idea. And so only then do they start going back into their files and seeing if there's anything to this. And they learn, as I write in the book, they had stuff on these guys going back years, but they never connected the dots because to them, organized crime was Italians.
In terms of what the Philadelphia Black Mafia did, in terms of the crimes they committed, in terms of the tactics they employed, in terms of the manner in which they used extortion or violence, did they have any kind of unique way of doing things as compared to the other ethnic groups? Or was it pretty much your typical violent extortion scheme that you would see from Italians or someone else?
Oh, no, it was, I would say 70 to 80% is pretty much what your audience would expect. But it was different in some respects, partly because of the times. So two things I would say made them very different. They were hyper violent. if there's a mob war, like in Philadelphia organized crime history, there 1980 when Angelo Bruno gets killed, and that sets off a wave of people being killed. And another thing similar happens in the early 90s. That's a noteworthy thing because there's a sea change going on in leadership.
Right.
We get that. What you don't see is what you saw in the case of Philly's Black Mafia, where they murdered so many people, 40, 50 people in a short span of time. And it wasn't just targets. It was their it was witnesses, their families. If they said, we're taking over this territory or don't testify against us next week or whatever, they meant it. They put out contracts on FBI agents and acted on them. They tried killing a Philadelphia Highway Patrol officer. That was the elite unit in the department at the time. They tried killing him twice. They were incredibly violent. And what's funny, and I write this in the book, if you look at their rap sheets, yeah, they might get charged with murder here and there, but because they so intimidated witnesses or flat out killed them, it wasn't crimes of violence that brought them down. Had they not actually engaged in the drug trade, and instead, if they had stepped back, and of course, gangsters, like most criminals, get greedy, instead of just taking a percentage, just take the street tax, they never would have gotten prosecuted, but they want to just take over the whole territory and become dealers themselves. Well, it doesn't matter what a tough guy you are. If you're on drug wires, you're on drug wires. If you're involved in the trade and you've got the stuff on you, you've got the stuff on you. So that's one thing. They were incredibly violent. But the other thing is, it's hard for your audience to remember, or they may not even know this. In the late 60s, early 70s, there was a big thing called the Community Action Agency push, which was the Department of Justice and the feds were purposely giving money to criminals. The idea was poverty was causing crime, and a way to stop the riots in the spring, in the summers, and also to get people into the system. They would purposely give people money in these community action agencies to get them off the street and get them out of crime. Well, groups like Philadelphia's Black Mafia, and I document this in my textbook, actually. Now, this case, there were examples of this all over the country in every big city where you had black hustlers taking the money. The money never got to the people that were theoretically supposed to get it. The gangsters not only took the money, they used it as a front. So now, if you're in Black Philly, the police department knows nothing about this massive organized crime conspiracy. These people are beating and killing people. And not only that, they're getting federal grants to open up storefronts. That's why the book is called Black Brothers Incorporated.
Right.
That was their most infamous front group. And so they would be doing press conferences with judges, city councilmen, the mayor. And so the public is like, wait a second. I hear from the street they're murderers and gangsters, but now I saw them on TV yesterday and they're getting millions of dollars in government grants. It was incredibly complex and confusing time for anyone in Black Philadelphia. And of course, they were the ones being victimized. So in those two regards, at least, Philly's Black Mafia was totally different than any other ethnic group I've ever studied. And importantly, Frank, the book, the updated version of the book, came out twice. First was in 2005. 57 people I wrote about in the 2005 version were convicted or pleaded guilty in a massive corruption probe. And so I had to write an updated version in 2007. Well, people who read the book will realize the only reason that massive corruption probe started in the first place by the FBI about racketeering and government corruption was because of the Black Mafia alums. They had been piped into the system in the 70s and stayed in it. And so by the time you got to the 2000s, they were doing what were called MBE frauds, minority business enterprise frauds. Same sort of thing. The government was trying to get money to urban areas, theoretically for law-abiding people, to get them into the system. And the hustlers just took the money.
Shopping is hard.
I can never find anything in my size.
I don't even know my size.
I buy my clothes the same place I buy my groceries.
There's a better way. Make it easy with Stitch Fix. Just share your size, style, budget, and done. Your personal stylist sends pieces picked just for you.
That was easy.
Stitch Fix. Online personal styling for everyone. Free shipping and returns. No subscription required. Get started today at stitchfix.com.
Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But DC politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.
That is wild. Everything you just said is amazing, and I'm amazed at myself that I didn't know about any of this. And I'm so glad that you're out there chronicling this and doing this sort of journalism. Hey, the fact that they called themselves the Philadelphia Black Mafia leads me to think that there was some degree of emulating Italian mafia families and La Cosa Nostra. Did they do anything else to sort of emulate La Cosa Nostra, whether it was straightening out ceremonies, whether it was putting people on the shelf, whether it was the hierarchy? Were there any other similarities between what we would call the Philadelphia Black Mafia compared to the Italian Mafia?
Yes. You and I could do a separate podcast on this, by the way, because a lot of the myths about the Italian guys is his own thing. But anyway, they made a colossal error because they bought a lot of the yes. So yes, they actually had a hierarchy. And I mentioned earlier in our podcast, they held meetings. Well, included in the meetings was their oath. This is all, I published all of this in the book. I have all this. They published their oath. They took minutes at the meetings. They had their hierarchy. You know, whether it was people who were in charge of the extortion, people in charge of the robberies, all that sort of stuff. They had their initiation ceremony, all that. But the problem is, for people who don't know this, real organized crime is disorganized crime, meaning only a moron would actually structure organized crime because it makes it easier for your competitors and for law enforcement to figure out. The good organized criminals are the ones right now somewhere drinking something with an umbrella in it, laughing that we're talking about these guys.
Right.
You know, and so, yeah, they did model it over what the media and Hollywood had said about organized crime. But that's what gets you jammed up. That's just stupid.
Very interesting. In terms of what you write about the Philadelphia Black Mafia, it's clear that they were not just a typical street gang, but they were a highly organized syndicate, not just with those government ties that you just mentioned and the ties to local politicians, but even ties to groups like the Nation of Islam, the Italian mob. How did those sort of alliances shape the group's power, shape the group's influence within Philly?
Sure. The Nation of Islam is an incredibly important part of the story. For your audience who doesn't know, the Nation of Islam at the time was an incredibly popular Black Power movement, right? We were getting away from the peaceful movement of Martin Luther King Jr. They didn't like that movement. They didn't think it was serious enough. They weren't getting enough response. So the Black Power movement with the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam rises as a way to get action that was not happening yet. Well, in Philly was one of the main Nation of Islam cities. Detroit, Chicago, New York was one. North Jersey had a few, but Philly was one of the big ones. And at that time, for your audience who doesn't know, they were recruiting heavy out of prisons. So for the public and for law enforcement, it was confusing. Their argument was, yes, we have criminals in our mosques, but that's the strategy to get them out of trouble and make them law-abiding citizens. Mm-hmm. Of course, you could never figure out what percentage of those people were actually hardened criminals that were not giving up their careers in crime and were actually using the mosque as a front. And so in Philadelphia's Black Mafia's case, all the leadership were all members of Nation of Islam Temple 12. All 56 mosques around the country were numbered. Philadelphia was number 12. It was headed by a person named Jeremiah Shabazz. His former name was Jeremiah Pugh. Jeremiah Shabazz, your audience may know, was one of the main people who recruited Muhammad Ali into the Nation of Islam. And that's why when Muhammad Ali was in exile from boxing because he dodged the draft, he spent his time in Philly. So that's why he gets so much play in the book, because he was living in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, hung out with the Black Mafia guys all the time. All the leadership in the mosque, all these what was then called the Fruit of Islam, they were the paramilitary guards. They protected the mosque, they protected the messenger, the head of the mosque, and they were all Black Mafia guys. So that's why there are so many pictures with Muhammad Ali and the Nation back then. Well, anyway, they exploited the mosque no different than they did the community action agencies, because they would say, oh, well, police or the FBI, they're going after us, not just because we're Black, but also because we're Muslim. So it was a genius move, because back then you couldn't get a search warrant for a house of worship. So they had law enforcement in all the big cities had major intel files saying the mosque is housing weapons. And one of the other things that would happen, if you were a Black Mafia member, obviously you're all routinely wanted by police. Well, now you have a Muslim name. Back then, Muslim wasn't even a thing. So law enforcement had no idea about these aliases. Robert Mims, wait, his now name is Amin Jabbar. They didn't get this at all. And not only that, when they were wanted, they would shop around to all the different mosques. So when they were wanted for murders, they would just go to another mosque in hiding until the coast was clear.
Oh my!
It was an amazing time. So that's one thing with the nation. The Italians, people get this wrong all the time. Now maybe it's different in New York City, but I doubt it. Generally speaking, disparate organized crime groups get along well. That's for a reason. If you're dealing in the underworld and you can't use traditional banking and traditional services, you need people at some point in time to offset bets, to offset drug deals that got stolen. You're constantly needing things to finesse. Well, it's helpful if your stuff is messed up and the group that theoretically you're in competition with is able to help you. So Philly's Black Mafia was tight with the Italians throughout this entire history. I mentioned earlier that I argued that your group, the syndicate, ended in 1984. Well, I also write from 85 until that corruption case in 2003, they were constantly in cahoots, all the Black Mafia alums and the next version of Italian gangsters in Philly, inside and out of prison. I write extensively about the prison networks. And the way that works is important because many people know that obviously Italian gangsters routinely have had dealings with unions over the years. Well, that was also the case in Philly with both groups, with the Italians and with the Black Mafia. And so there's a great case in the book where the roofers union in Philly, they get arrested for federal racketeering cases. And where do they go for protection in prison before they go in? They go to the head of Philadelphia's Black Mafia. They don't go to the Italians. They go to the head of Philly's Black Mafia because they're running Graterford Prison in Pennsylvania. They're running all the prisons in Philly. They can give you protection. And not only that, when you get out, they have jobs set up for you. So if you're trying to get early release from prison, you have to file what is called a home plan. And that includes prospectus for getting a job. Well, it's all fake, but doesn't matter. On paper, it works. And so they have an entire network of that. These are highly sophisticated criminals.
That is wild. I'm absolutely floored by this. Let's talk about Sam Christian, the leader of the Black Mafia. Apparently, he was one of the most feared men on the streets of Philadelphia. What was it about his leadership style that allowed him to command such loyalty and instill such fear?
I think it was his combination of brains and brawn. A lot of these guys were murderers. That alone is obviously noteworthy and intimidating, but he was shrewd. And first of all, he was a very physically imposing person. He was a very big guy. This is before people lifted weights a lot. He was just naturally a big guy. And beyond that, he was very, very violent. In fact, the only case he ever got prosecuted for violence, he shot a New York City police officer up in New York City where they were robbing a record store. But other than that, he never faced criminal prosecution. That murder I mentioned earlier about Atlantic City, he was one of the 4 hitmen who went to Atlantic City. And what did he do? He walked across the street, had a drink while the cops were coming to the scene. He was just a different cat. And so Sam Christian gets the credit for forming the group, like I say, in the mid 60s or whatever. And it's hard to explain this to your audience. He was so feared. I give a few examples of this in the book. He would go up to craps games. Craps was a really big deal at that time in Black Philadelphia on street corners. And he would go up to a street game to throw craps, and people would start giving him the money. And he said, no, I'm here to play. Like, everyone was just assuming that he was there as a menace. That's how much his reputation was, even among other criminals. But I walked through all the white collar scams that they had in the book, all the community action agency stuff. Sam Christian was a sophisticated criminal who happened to be okay with killing people.
The Atlantic City incident, is that the incident where 2 adults and 5 children were massacred? No. So walk us through that. That's one of the most infamous crimes attributed to the Black Mafia. Walk us through the circumstances that led to a horrific incident like that. 2 adults, 5 children killed, and the impact on the community and on law enforcement's response to the Philadelphia Black Mafia.
Sure. By the way, your audience should know that a few of those kids were less than 2 years old. They were drowned in a bathtub.
Goodness.
Drowned in a bathtub, including a 9-day-old baby.
Oh, my goodness. As the father of a 2-year-old myself, I can tell you that's it's enough to make your skin crawl.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a tough narrative in the book because the mother actually gets shot. What they would do in most of their murders, for some reason, they would take people, put them in closets, make them kneel, and then execute them. Oftentimes they would hogtie them also. And in this particular case, the mother of the children, they thought they had killed her. They shot, but meanwhile, she had actually survived. And unfortunately for her, she actually wound up witnessing the drownings. But anyway, the reason the murders happened, incidentally, the largest mass murder in D.C. history. And yet, no, what's funny is these stories are so crazy. If these were Italian gangsters, you and all your audience would know their names by heart.
Right.
Because they were black gangsters, no one knows about any of this. Anyway, so the reason the murders happened, I mentioned earlier, the Philly's Black Mafia was entirely immersed in Nation of Islam. Well, one of the people who left, just like Malcolm X left the nation and met his fate, another person in the leadership of the Nation of Islam left. He also believed that they were not following true Islam, that they were more a political, racial separatist group. Well, when he left, his name was Ernest McGee. He changed his name to Hamas Abdul Khalis, rejected the Nation of Islam, and became a Sunni Muslim, and he took on the name Hamas Abdul Khalis. His famous convert, by the way, was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, formerly Lou Alcindor.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, as a way of paying his mentor back, Lou Alcindor, Kareem buys Hamas Abdul Khalis this beautiful mansion in the Gold Coast suburb of Washington, D.C., and Hamas Abdul Khalis writes a letter, a really damning letter, that says all sorts of terrible things about Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam at the time. Well, days after that letter gets to Philadelphia's Temple 12, a hit squad goes down to Washington, D.C. They survey the area. They surveil the area. They go back. They map out what routes are good, getting close to highways. They then go down and rent a hotel. I mentioned earlier the community actions agencies. The only reason the FBI was able to solve this crime was because they used credit cards that were tied back to the community action agencies to rent the hotel room. But anyway, they go down there and they murder the family as a way of getting back at Hamas Abdul Khalis for writing the damning letter. As it turns out, Hamas was not there. He was out food shopping. He came back and saw all the mayhem. And people may know that 4 years later, in 1977, Hamas Abdul Khalis was upset that the people who killed his kids were never only four of the 8 people who did it were arrested, and none of them got the death penalty because from 72 to 76, the death penalty was unconstitutional. So when they were convicted in 73 and 74, they weren't subject. Well, he was frustrated at the criminal justice system, took matters into his own hands. He and his followers, the Hanafi Muslims in D.C., took over the B'nai B'rith headquarters and 2 other government buildings, killed one person, and held people hostage for a day or two. It was a national scene, of course, demanding it. The famous quote was, "I want the killers of my babies." And of course, that wasn't going to happen. And he finally surrendered. And ironically, he wound up dying in prison. And a bunch of the people who actually did the killings of his family who never faced justice.
Oh, my goodness. This is absolutely incredible. Just to go back to what you said about how it was the drug trade that ultimately brought down the Philadelphia Black Mafia, at least vis-a-vis law enforcement. There were numerous arrests. There were numerous convictions. And through it all, the Black Mafia continued their rampage for years. How were they able to maintain this sort of power, even while under constant scrutiny from law enforcement?
Well, again, I think your audience probably knows this. Federal law enforcement, well, even local law enforcement, but especially the FBI, they don't get those tools that you and I are so familiar with now, witness immunity, witness protection, wiretaps. That only starts happening in the early 70s. And the feds really don't get a handle on how to use that, how to prosecute those cases until you get to the late 70s, early 80s, which is why organized crime for all groups starts getting diminished starting in the 1980s, because now it's easy to wire everybody for sound, get surveillance and all that. And you can only intimidate people so much if you're on wires doing it. I can threaten you and I know you're not going to tell, but what if your wiretapped? Well, anyway, so early days, it was because the feds didn't have the tools. I always say that if Philly's Black Mafia had started earlier, they would have lasted even longer, because they came around. They hit their stride at the wrong time. That was right when all the federal tools were getting enacted. But anyway, it was partly that. It was partly ignorance of law enforcement. It wasn't until, the original case was 73, and then they finally developed their own intel on Philly's Black Mafia. But beyond that, it just like organized crime of any group, the extortion rackets were incredibly important, especially when they had the backing of the government. I mean, these were literally government-funded racketeers. So they could easily launder money, move people, move product. So that's partly why. And then when you get to the late 80s, early 90s, all they had left was drugs. And that's just that's why, incidentally, for those, your audience would be shocked if they read the book. Some of the Black Mafia leaders from the 1960s and 70s wind up getting arrested for shootings and killings in the 90s and 2000s. They serve their time for the big racketeering cases and get out. And of course, they don't become bankers and accountants. They go back on the street and they wind up in their old games. So, people in their 60s and 70s were still trying to take over territories.
Yeah, geez, that's incredible. You also spend some time chronicling the rise of the junior Black Mafia in the 80s, and that seemed to follow the collapse of the original organization. What were the key differences between these two groups, and how did the emergence of crack affect their structure and their influence?
Yeah, I always feel bad for the original Black Mafia guys in the sense that the JBM took the name, and that they took the name for glamour more than anything else, because the ties, there are very few ties. If you hear Junior Black Mafia, you would assume as an outsider, oh my gosh, there must be lineage, there must be connections. There really isn't. Sam Christian served that time in prison, like I mentioned earlier, for shooting a New York City police officer. He got out of prison. He, quote unquote, mentored them a little bit, but that was nothing noteworthy. Nudie Mims was another legendary Black Mafia guy who for a time was out. He also dealt with them a little bit, but there was really no ties between the Black Mafia and Junior Black Mafia. And they existed roughly from 85 until 1992. And in their case, all they did was deal crack. They didn't do any extortion. There was no gambling, none of the racketeering that you would imagine. There was no union involvement. The prison networks I mentioned earlier, that was not part of their world. So to me, they were just a flash in the pan drug gang. Whereas Philly's Black Mafia was an incredibly large, vast, actual power syndicate that took over entire sections of the city with all sorts of enterprises.
You had access, as you alluded to, all sorts of primary source material, confidential informant logs, FBI files, wiretaps. What were some of the most shocking or revealing details that emerged from the sources that you got to review as you were researching this and as you were writing this?
Wow. Well, one of the things that shocked me the most, this isn't real. I'll answer your question more directly, but one of the things that comes to mind is, don't forget, I started this research in 1992, years after all this had happened.
Right.
And so when I'm looking at the intel files from the early 60s, and I'm reading all the things, and I'm realizing, oh my goodness, this murder could have been solved. Oh my goodness, these are those guys. It was crazy looking at the raw intel and how much they actually had if they knew it. They could have cracked down on this way earlier and solved a lot of problems. Like there were a few informants who clearly knew everything, but law enforcement just didn't act on it. Because what would happen if somebody was murdered, you'd see a homicide file, and my goodness, the detail would be incredible on who they thought did it and who they were hanging with. But the problem was homicide wouldn't share that information with organized crime or with the intel units or with the FBI or ATF or IRS or any the task force or strike force. So that was the problem. There were all these disparate pieces of information, but no one knew. So I know that's not your answer, but shocking as far as what I saw in the intel files. One of the things you would notice if you're not in law enforcement, if you read the raw wiretap transcripts, it's incredibly hard to do things anonymously on the phone. Imagine trying to talk to somebody without saying their name, without him or her saying your name, and without divulging what you're actually talking about, whether it's gambling, drugs, shaking somebody down, killing somebody. The wiretap transcripts are hilarious to read because they don't know what they're saying. You as the reader know what they're trying. I give you an example of that in the book too. So that was a lot of fun. I'll tell you one thing that your audience would like to know too. Law enforcement files, in my opinion, get a bad rap. And the assumption among my colleagues in academia is that law enforcement files, by definition, are biased toward prosecution. I can imagine why that's so. I get that. But if you actually read raw intel, if I monitored you for a day or a week, the vast majority is boring.
Right. Oh,
taking your kid to school, doing what, you actually can learn a heck of a lot about the sociology or the history of a neighborhood or of an environment just by that. And again, I try and paint that picture in the books too. The raw intel files were invaluable for that.
Let's talk about what was going on in Philadelphia itself in the late 60s and early 70s. There was a significant social and political upheaval that was going on. How did the broader environment of racial tension, of the civil rights struggles, contribute, if it did, to the rise of the Black Mafia?
Oh, no, it did. I'm sure New York dealt with the same thing. Most of the
no doubt.
The northeastern cities were all dealing with this interesting time where you had a lot of blacks moving from the South looking for more peaceful, less racial issues. And so they come up north. But the problem was Philly, like most northeastern times, had no jobs. It was at a bad time economically. So you had rampant poverty. There's a line from an historian who said Southern blacks were piped onto a sinking ship, meaning they take this sojourn up north and there's nothing there. Well, in Philly, you had rampant crime. And so what happens, the Black Mafia guys, never mind the Nation of Islam and the community action agencies, they're preying on the fact that law enforcement has this racist history. And the thing was, especially in Philly, it's interesting. Your audience may know of a very controversial program called COINTELPRO, which was short for counterintelligence programs. There were versions of that. One of the versions of it was for quote unquote black nationalist groups, meaning targeting the Black Panthers, the Nation of Islam, and things like that. And one of the things they were doing was they were being subversive to the subversive. Hoover's argument was he feared that the disparate black power groups would get together and overthrow the government. Now, however crazy that sounds, that's what he believed. So they put together this massive apparatus. Well, they start trying to infiltrate all the different black power movements and civil rights movements. So if you're Philly's Black Mafia, you can honestly say to people, hey, don't believe that stuff you see in the news. They're setting us all up, because some of that really was happening. But that allowed them to manipulate people into thinking that they were the ones really, really murdering people, beating people up, taking their places, setting storefronts on fire, all that stuff. So they were shrewd in how they played that racial manipulation. It was genius.
Just in talking to you, it's very clear that Philadelphia's Black Mafia has a pretty unique place in the history of organized crime. In what ways do you think their legacy lives on in modern organized crime, either in Philadelphia or beyond Philly?
Well, in Philly, it's hard for you to imagine this. When I was doing the book tour the first time in 2005, I had so many black leaders want me to speak at their church or at a community hall or whatever, because they said it was a great message. At the original version of Black Brothers, the cover was just of one of the Black Mafia murder victims' homicide photos and the mugshots of the 14 founding Black Mafia members. And he said, this is what I show to all the kids in my congregation, because the cover alone tells a story. You get involved in that world, you either wind up dead or in prison. And that seemed like a very helpful thing. It was nice to hear that. Well, he called me however long after that and said, man, couldn't have been more wrong about this. Here I am thinking this is going to solve the problem, help solve the problem. And what had happened on the street, people had taken the cover of the book and put it on black T-shirts and were selling it at bus stops and subway stops. They literally had black market, Black Mafia T-shirts, and the Black Mafia guys embraced it. People thought that Black Mafia guys would be furious at me. No, they thought this was the ultimate validation. You know, I told you what a badass I was, and here's the evidence. You know, here's the book. I can't tell you how many books I've signed for Black Mafia guys who are serving life in prison.
That is wild.
Oh, I don't know if you know this. You actually can't get books in prison. So what they do, they'll pay off a corrections guard, either contact me privately or show up at a book signing. And I used to sign stacks of books for prisoners because the corrections guard had all the Black Mafia guys who were asking for them. Sam Christian, actually, before he died, he asked me to write his autobiography. But the problem was he wouldn't admit to any of the murders. And I said, well, what's so interesting about this?
That's incredible. Lastly, Sean, and I hope we could talk again because whenever we've spoken, I'm always just so blown away, not only at all the information you have, but your incredible detail as a storyteller and the way that you weave in facts and kind of the broader context and the broader color. So I appreciate that. But this is such a compelling story. It's so fascinating. And I hope people do check out your book, Black Brothers, Inc., The Violent Rise and Fall of Philadelphia's Black Mafia. Has there ever been, forget about a good movie, a movie about the Philadelphia Black Mafia that's at least worth checking out?
Unfortunately, no. There have been several attempts. The book has been optioned a few times, but none of them ever came to fruition. In fact, your audience can go look it up online. There was a period of, 3 or 4 years where DiCaprio and Warner Brothers had it, and we were far along in that process. The script was incredible. They were assigning people, and the budget ran out, and it just died. I was so hopeful that was going to go. DiCaprio was slated to play the journalist. If people read the book, the journalist who was the first person to write about this, even before law enforcement knew what the heck was going on, was a guy named Jim Nicholson. And DiCaprio was slated to play Jim Nicholson in the movie, but it never happened. So there's always hope. There's always interest, but it just hasn't happened.
Well, that is a shame. Sean P. Griffin, it is always great to talk with you. I hope we can do this again soon.
I'd love it.
If someone sent you this podcast, do us a favor and send it on to someone else. Please share it on social media and subscribe. You could find the Racket Report in any podcast app, Apple, iTunes, you name it, Spotify. Just search the Racket Report, hit the subscribe button. If you also give us a 5-star rating and a nice little comment, that really helps spread the visibility of the podcast. Until the next time we meet in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.